English translation 900-second contact. Sunday, 8th December 2024, 15:34 hours.
There you are. Greetings and welcome to you all. And Arlian, I thought you were coming here a fortnight ago when Quetzal told me you were coming.
That was not planned. It was for later.
I guess that was my mistake, because I should have explained that Arlian's coming will not be until this month. Excuse me for my oversight.
It is no big deal. Sometimes you just forget to say or explain something in more detail. It also happens to me sometimes.
I also greet you, and I see you are well. I should also say hello to you from Florina and Injana and tell you that they will pick you up next Wednesday and take you too.
Good. That is no problem if they get here early enough, because I should be back here at 11:30 hours because...
That should be plenty of time because they want to take you to see.
They could also do that without me.
They feel safer if you accompany them, which is also the case for me if I can fulfill these tasks together with you. You know that
Yes, I know that because your mentality is not exactly geared towards that, which I have already noticed with Quetzal and Ptah, and earlier with Simyase and Asket. That is why I think it does not really matter whether I am working here in the office or on the road helping you. And that you are entrusted with such tasks that can...
That is unfortunately necessary, because we have undertaken to observe all such happenings, along with other processes, occurrences and events and various incidents, etc., that seem important to us, Playaran, to record them on our devices with images if possible and to register them.
I already know that, because your grandfather Svath has already explained everything to me in this regard. But it is perhaps for the readership of our dialogue reports or contact reports to learn a little more about all the tasks and work you have to do on Earth and for what, etc.
Arlian, if it is not uncomfortable for you and you are not activity and time bound, then I will explain in a little more detail what Edward asked me for.
I am not in a hurry.
Good. Regarding what I have said, you are informed, but for us these observations are largely to be carried out and recorded. Thinking and perception are very burdensome, as you are well aware, for we Playaran do not wage wars, have no crime, as well as no crimes to be punished, which is largely so in our Federation as well. That period?
With that, you are probably referring to the psyche, which has to absorb and cope with what you take in through your perception, and you then have to process through thought processes. I can well understand and empathize with this, and I have also experienced this very often, as well as being able to help when such problems arose, because I also learned to deal with them at a young age with Svath, and to process everything. He also had to do that long before he took me under his wing, and he was a good teacher for me in that and in everything.
That is known to me from his annals, but how and what he learned to process, and therefore through his perceptions and his thoughts, he came to terms with everything and got free of the stressful problems affecting him with regard to his feelings, his sensations, the emotions and other impulses, as well as in his behavior, etc. He did not record anything about that, which is why we have no knowledge of this. A dot.
Excuse me, but that cannot be described, because that is impossible. Because basically every human being is absolutely fundamentally different from another. Consequently, everyone has an individual way of thinking and perceiving, as well as a way of understanding. This, just as he also has an equally individual way of processing method, and thus also his own way of processing thoughts. Intelligentum, logic, reason, and personal confidence in one's own judgment of what is to be processed mentally also play a role. According to all these values, every human being processes his or her perceptions in an absolutely individual way, whereby this way of processing thoughts is really absolutely personal and individual, and cannot be described. But when I look closely at and analyze the majority of humanity on Earth, especially with regard to personal development in terms of the formation of general knowledge, righteousness, general behavior and conduct, true humanity, mentality, morality, and logical, independent thinking, then I notice something terrible. This is because the majority of humanity does not think for itself in any wise, but is enslaved to a religious or worldly belief, and is effectively foreign to all the values of life. The majority of human beings on Earth use all their energy to cause mischief, because in the depths of their character still lurks unresolved everything that is unbalanced. Consequently, hatred, revenge, retaliation, violence, manslaughter, and murder of all kinds are commonplace and much more diverse than the majority of human beings are able to imagine. This is especially true of the majority of Earth humans, who do not concern themselves with reality and its truth, but live indifferently and dully into the day and do not think deeply about murders and their diversity, which are committed for the most diverse reasons and impulses. In this regard, I will only list the following from the whole wide range, such as capital murder, religious murder, moral murder, clan murder as well as ritual murder, revenge murder, laughing murder, murder of lust, murder for hire, murder by negligence, and manslaughter. Then there is robbery murder, love murder, retaliation murder, delusion murder, faith murder and suicide or suicide, satisfaction murder, mass murder, treachery murder and sexual murder, assassination, murder for hire, cruelty murder, and murder by concealment. Separation murder, jealousy murder, thrill murder, and premeditated murder should also be mentioned, as should anger murder, emotional murder, quarrel murder, strife murder, vision murder, power murder, and control murder. Child murder should not be forgotten, which is often committed by one's own parents. But group murder and sect murder should also be mentioned, as well as entertainment murder, anger murder and excitement murder, opinion murder, fear murder, concealment murder, control murder, rage murder, spray murder, enabling murder, mission murder, hate murder, fun murder, and amok murder, etc. Although there are numerous other types of murder that are carried out daily in the vast mass of humanity. But this does not include the countless murders that are committed in every war, as well as the massacres, rapes, tortures, criminal acts and crimes, etc. that take place in every war, which remain unpunished and are constantly lurking as memories in the minds of those who were personally affected by them as victims. Now, as soon as something happens that triggers the mischief makers constantly lurking in the deepest depths of the character, it only has to be a word. Whether justified or unjustified, the human being immediately feels unjustified and reacts aggressively. This is particularly the case if they are opinionated, self-important, attacking or believe that they alone are doing everything correctly, etc. very quickly. Human beings, if they are unbalanced and lack self-control, or are addicted to possessiveness, bossiness, aggression and also quick-temperedness, self-importance and arrogance, etc., release the negativities that lie dormant and suppressed in the depths of their character and immediately let everything burst outwards. It is therefore not perceptible to the fellow human beings who witness such outbursts, and also not recognizable to the human beings themselves who are affected by them, that such an uncontrolled outburst causes a form of underlying anger and hatred to bubble up, which in the worst case can lead to murder and manslaughter. If a human being is predisposed in this way, whereby he creates the predisposition himself through his very own uncontrolled thoughts, feelings and impulses, and also by copying other people's educational mistakes, actions and behavior, etc., then he has acquired all the deviant, abnormal, evil, and nasty qualities of human being, unworthiness himself in a completely uncontrolled manner, which have become deeply ingrained in his character. These then erupt at every suitable or unsuitable opportunity, with these evil, bad, and inhuman character traits intensifying over the course of a lifetime. Under certain circumstances, they can develop into urges, greed, evil instincts, pleasure, vice, and lust, which usually develop into these inhuman, unworthy traits when the human being, man or woman, adult or adolescent, has to face the enemy in the military and in war, and must inevitably commit murders. Every military of every country, and also NATO, whether active or currently dormant, is nothing more and nothing less than a murderer's organization that turns every human being into a murderer who joins a military organization compulsorily or voluntarily and kills human beings voluntarily or has to do so on command. And it makes no difference whatsoever whether killing is done in an insurrection, in a war, or in any other way. For the killing of human beings is and always will be, and in any case always will be murder, and that is never of the right, and that is also observed by every Homo sapiens with dignity and honor. Whereas, however, every single human being who does not belong to this species and is not capable of logic, understanding, and reason will sooner or later become deviant if the right circumstances lead him to become a murderer, and this is unfortunately inherent in the majority of Earth humans. In fact, only a minority of all human beings have, through their own controlled and conscious development, become stable, true human beings in such a way that they would never, under any circumstances, freak out and kill another human being. The human beings who really deserve to be called Homo sapiens, and who do not fall prey to degenerate anger and acts of rage, even if they may necessarily shout because the situation requires it nolens volens to clarify the facts, etc., are independent, hardworking, honest, and helpful citizens of the earth who truly deserve the seal of being true human beings. Thou shalt not kill has been said since time immemorial by human beings who, as Homo sapiens, cultivated true human being before, according to biblical legend, a man named Moses climbed Mount Sinai in the Sinai Desert after the Hebrews fled Egypt and came down with recommendations written on stone slabs, one of which is also said to have said, "Thou shalt not kill." This is exactly what was taught by Nocedemian a very long time ago by early ancestors of the Pleiaren, who found their way to Earth from the Ankar universe, and then taught it as a guideline and behavior for human beings to the dark-skinned Abram from Africa, who was the leader of the Hebron community, which, as I know, as the Pleiaren records say, was located somewhere in the area and at the source of the river Tigris, in an area that today, I think, belongs to southern Turkey. However, Abram and his group were not the first human beings, just as the alleged paradise story of Adam and Eve was not, because human beings existed on Earth long before these made-up, fanciful claims, but their origins cannot be traced back to Charles Darwin's lying assertion. The truth is that human beings on Earth emerged in prehistoric times from animal beings. Creeping creatures and scaly creatures, and consequently various species of the genus human being emerged, which originally emerged from the Earth's waters. Mainly the oceans, but also the soil, were infiltrated with viruses, bacteria, microbes, and other microorganisms brought from space by asteroids, comets, and so-called stardust. In addition to this, various Earth foreigners appeared, including snake-skinned and scale-skinned ones, which appeared on Earth in various forms. Svath taught me, contrary to what I had been taught at school, and contrary to the Earthlings' claim that there were no life forms in airless space, asteroids, comets, and stardust, that life was everywhere, at least in the form of viruses, microbes, and other microorganisms, also in the airless space of outer space, as well as on Earth in the ice. And Svath also proved all this to me. Using apparatus and microscopes, etc., it is now known that life exists in asteroids, comets, and in so-called stardust, but that there are thousands of living beings, viruses, microbes, and other microorganisms in free space, and in all the ice on Earth and in all the suns. Planets and moons that appear dead has not yet, as far as I know, penetrated the circles of self-important science. There are life forms everywhere, such as viruses, which are inactive in themselves, but become active as soon as they can settle or attach themselves to a suitable host, as Svath taught. Svath also taught, and I remember this very well, that in the entire field of matter, all life forms are Dan-like, which means that new genera and species of life forms can always arise as a result of any combination of these. The very diverse viruses, microbes, bacteria, and microorganisms that are deposited in water, ice, rock, and soil can carry pathogens that may be capable of causing known or unknown diseases or rampantly spreading diseases in human beings, and also in animals, creatures, and other creatures in fauna and flora. The community consisted of a few thousand and a few hundred more human beings, from which the Hebrews later emerged as they moved further and further south and then settled there. They were called Hebrews because they were nomadic cattle breeders with camels, cattle, and donkeys, and traveled around the country. Before that, however, the Hebron community had originally only settled in the area where the Tigris River originated, but then migrated to the southeastern part of the Persian Gulf, as the area is called today, but at that time Mesopotamia. And from there they began the actual nomadic migration southwards, which was around 4,000 years ago. As usual,
However,
everything is misrepresented mendaciously and fraudulently or simply inventively and embellishingly, as for example in the Jewish religious book Tanakh, which comes up with a tall tale, as is also the case with the Christian Bible and also in other religious books. So, in order to lie and deceive and sell the origin of a people and their imaginary god, everything in the holy religious books is not only presented as lies and completely false facts, but also catches all the bogus believers, with whose money a lot of wealth is made. The believers are robbed of money and assets, etc., through the beliefs they have been indoctrinated with, whereby the saviors or the cultists, gurus, cult leaders, religious faith representatives, who have the smear of all the religious lies or deception served up to them and the believers, are caught, with a few exceptions, who only hold this office for the sake of their earnings, but not for the sake of their faith, can receive a salary that is effectively paid out for lying to and deceiving believers, for which those who have fallen prey to faith, in their low intelligence and bogus thinking, still pay taxes and donate their mite. And this is only possible because the believers, who do not have the ability to think for themselves, believe all the nonsense served up to them by the cult gurus, etc., and consider it to be true. But for this it is necessary, especially now that after Arleon no more dialogue reports can be brought in and written down for months, that I still say something of importance. I therefore think that human beings on Earth should be taught what is right and what they should follow at all times, namely the following.
The human being should always be self-thinking and never believing. Therefore, examine everything and every word he hears, reads, or otherwise perceives as to its reality, as well as regarding the truth. Think about it independently and freely, uninfluenced by any belief. Fathom the whole thing completely, and if the result undoubtedly corresponds to the truth in every form, take this into himself as effectively true value. 2. The human being should never allow himself to be influenced by any form of belief. Should not become a believer and should only rely on what he can prove to himself through his own research, thinking, and experience. 3. The human being should never worship or glorify a fellow human being, nor should he become a slave to anyone, but should show due honor and dignity to all fellow human beings and always remain constant and equal in his assessment of reality and its irrefutable truth. 4. The human being should never allow himself to be seduced into worshiping a human being or an imaginary being, neither into an existential belief of a religious or worldly nature, nor also into a belief in opinions, deeds, actions, and other things. 5. The human being should never allow himself to be indoctrinated, but should always make decisions and carry out actions himself in all things through his own independent thinking and ability in accordance with logic, understanding, and reason. Consequently, he should not allow himself to be commanded, but should fulfill all his duties with the necessary energy in accordance with his own well-considered judgment and decision. 6. The human being must always remain himself. He must always remain modestly a human being, without the airs and graces of wanting to be great and wanting to be more than his neighbor. And he must not make himself a guru or a saint, and must always remain modestly himself, righteous and correct. 7. The human being should always be ready to educate himself in every possible way as a result of his own efforts and to become knowledgeable in many ways, so that he may become wise and knowledgeable and helpful to life and to his neighbor, just as he also holds creation in honor and dignity, which is nature and all its existence, energy and power in universal vastness. 8. The human being is the crown of creation, which he should protect at all times, and, being in harmony with it, honor and dignify it, for he lives through it. That is to say, nature and all its energy and power throughout the universe, as do all life forms in general. 9. Let human beings not inflict enmity, suffering, or pain of any kind on themselves, their neighbors, or any other living beings, but show them honor and dignity, whatever their gender, skin color, positive or negative views, attitudes, behavior, and actions, etc., or whether they are self-thinking or believers. These are the 9 most important behaviors that I have to mention at the moment, but which I must continue to insist on. 1. Never, ever make a religion out of the teachings of Figu, and so the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life shall and must never become a religion or the like. This teaching should also not be changed, falsified, or otherwise rewritten, supplemented, or shortened in any wise. 2. For my part, I am not a guru, saint, or miracle worker, etc., nor am I someone who should be worshipped and glorified. I am also not a sectarian, a genius, a highly gifted person, a luminary, or a miracle worker, but just a simple human being.
And that is all that needs to be said. To know and adhere to everything else I have said or explained requires neither an imaginary heavenly God and Son of God, nor a crazy belief in one. Because clear logic, understanding, and reason alone tell us that human beings, as the only self-thinking beings on Earth, should value, honor, and protect all life. And that no dear God does this is proven by the fact that human beings are very, very often hostile towards each other. For how else could it be? If a God protects and loves all life, why does he allow murder and manslaughter, lies and deceit, as well as hatred, revenge, retaliation, enmity and war, greed and all evil and wickedness to run rampant throughout the earth? And why does the alleged God proclaim, "Go forth and multiply," with which 9.6 billion human beings are already populating the earth and completely destroying, and driving all of nature, its fauna and flora, to absolute ruin? Is this God blind that he does not see all this? Or is he so lowly intelligent and simple-minded that he surpasses even the stupidest human beings? But how lowly intelligent and simple-minded must a human being be who believes these lies and deceptions about an imaginary God, who folds his hands and prays to something imaginary and therefore non-existent, instead of endeavoring to do and accomplish what he needs or wants with his own energy and strength, with logic, understanding, and reason. But human beings, and indeed the majority of Earth humans, do not usually do this, because they pretend to believe in this imaginary dear God, that they will always do what is right, and that this imaginary God must therefore have mercy and give help. The full reality and its truth, however, is that this alone means that the entire creation, and therefore nature, fauna and flora, the cosmos and its universe-wide energy and power, cannot continue to exist as it should. The human being of Earth murders reality and truth, and destroys everything that is creation-given and worthy of life, therefore also human beings themselves in many wise ways. But if the human being, who is supposed to be the self-thinking protector and guardian of all things of the entire creation, and truly is, or should be, is murdered, then he does exactly the opposite, and also by multiplying so excessively that he harasses, destroys and eradicates all that he's supposed to protect and guard, namely the entire creation, to such an extent that it becomes more and more unfit for life, and ultimately perishes completely. The Earth and its nature, that is to say creation with all its universe-wide energy and power, is designed for this planet for 500 million, but at most for 2 billion human beings, but not for 9.6 billion and even more, as completely crazy people demand, such as the errant rulers in the Federal Council, National Council and Council of States in Switzerland. In Germany, the part of the neo-Nazis in the government, in France, President Macron, and in Russia, Putin, who even wants to ban childless marriages, as this fantasy is currently haunting him. In addition, Ava and I and others think that all these lunatics who are calling for this want to create more believers in terms of religion and faith on the one hand, but that others are also addicted to the supposedly imaginary divine go forth and multiply. This, just as money certainly also plays an important role, which will then be wrung from all the descendants through high taxes and donations, just as these descendants can also serve as cannon fodder in a war or something. But the majority of Earthlings do not want to accept this and trample this truth underfoot, even throwing admonitions to the wind and destroying monuments that are orientated towards the truth and make known and show what should be urgently observed and acted upon by Earthlings, but which is ignored and acted upon in the opposite way. Religious believers of all kinds and other sectarians as well as lunatics even find it necessary to silence human beings, to simply shoot them in the head, throw knives into their backs or otherwise eliminate them from the world, as well as also endangering the lives of others, as has happened several times when people have tried to blow out my lifelight. Fortunately, it has not succeeded 25 times so far, although this time was really lucky. It was probably 2 years ago now, when Marianne, Willem and I were sitting outside the house when the shot rang out, which, due to the carelessness of the shooter, instead of hitting me or my 2 conversation partners, twittered into the sky. Now, the fact that the enemies of truth are trying everything they can to not only commit murders in their religious delusion, but also to murder those who tell the truth about their religious beliefs, reminds me of what happened in the Middle Ages, when more than 65,000 men and women were tortured, drowned, or burned alive in Europe through lies and galvanization because they were allegedly in league with the devil. This in Europe, while in faraway America the alleged devil worshippers were hanged.
There I remember what I read about it in my grandfather Svath's annals, that you saw together. It was 1680 or so, I do not remember exactly, but I remember that it was in a village, which I also do not remember the name of, that between 20 and 30 human beings were hanged there because they were accused of being witch worshippers out of hatred. You were also together when a woman accused of being a witch in Switzerland.
Yes, her name was Anna Galdi, and she was innocently accused of being the last witch in Switzerland. That was about 200 years ago. And the woman was put to the sword as an alleged poisoner, witch and child murderer. The real reason being that she had a secret relationship with her breadwinner and had children, one of whom died in childbirth, which is why she was mainly accused of being a child murderer and poisoner, but of witchcraft. However, none of the accusations were true. But her lover, who was her master, was driven by his jealous wife with threats to deny Anna Galdi, and she was executed by the sword, which triggered a revolt throughout Europe.
Yes, that is also how it is listed in the annals.
That will be so, because I know that Svath in particular was also shocked, namely that such injustice also happened in Switzerland. But that is still the case today, just in a different nasty form. Today it is the case that certain rulers can commit treason and are not punished for it, as has just happened in Byrne, as well as that recently, without consulting the people and letting them vote on it. Treaties are being concluded with the EU that will put Switzerland at a political disadvantage in the future and make a mockery of neutrality, as is the case with the fact that the murderous organization NATO is also being brought into play by the Federal Council, and senior Swiss military officers are to enjoy lessons with this murderous rabble. The idea is that at the beginning of next year, senior Swiss military officers are to take part in at least one exercise or so at NATO. This is an unparalleled betrayal of the country, which was initiated by the Federal Palace in Bern in defiance of other federal councilors. And the miserable traitorous elements in the government then call this a good relationship between Switzerland and neighboring countries and the world. But the fact that this makes a mockery of state sovereignty, or our independence from the influence of other states, and thus also the security of Switzerland and the Swiss people, is not understood by the government vegetables, who were born long after the World War, and did not experience how Switzerland and its people were only spared from direct acts of war thanks to neutrality. This is apart from the fact that, despite neutrality, the military judiciary pronounced 33 death sentences for treason and executed 17 for treason. Even then, the death sentences were a violation of neutrality, as this also implied that every life would be protected. Also in the case of treason, so that such a person would be punished, but not by execution and thus death, but by a hefty and lengthy prison sentence. Back then, it was the Nazi World War, when I was staying with my Aunt Martha, one of my father's sisters, and also with my godfather Alfred Fluckiger, who was a warden at Regensdorf prison. I sneaked off with him to the Katzensee. It was probably April 1943. I cannot remember exactly, because he knew about the execution of a traitor. We were then able to sneak up despite the guards, hid, and watched the execution without being caught. I was 6 years old at the time and also met Elsie Moser in the village center, but we never saw each other again. Then in the 1970s, after about 30 years, she suddenly appeared at my house in Hinwil on Vihaldenstrasse and, today I can say yes, told me that she had been asked to do so by Sim Yase. With regard to what was said about neutrality, Achim Wolf subsequently sent me the following article for the site Zeichen, without him knowing anything about the conversation between Quetzal, Arlian and myself, which I am now enclosing in addition to the report on the conversation. Now that traitorous rulers in Switzerland are making a mockery of state neutrality, Swiss neutrality will then only exist as a souvenir, if what the traitors really want is actually achieved, which will then be the fault of irresponsible and lousy elements of the government who, if I may mention this again, have no idea how damn close Switzerland came to being destroyed by the Nazis in the last World War, who have already proclaimed, "Little Switzerland, the porcupine, we will take it in retreat." But these idiots, who are today in Bern tossing around this betrayal of neutrality, did not hear that, because these young treacherous vegetables were not yet alive at the time and did not realize all the good that true neutrality had done for this Switzerland and the Swiss people during the Nazi World War, and that they had avoided direct acts of war. As far as sectarians are concerned, who do everything to prevent people from talking about curbing overpopulation? There is, for example, the fact that in 2022 the Guidestone Monument in Georgia, USA was blown up and destroyed by sectarians, which was already mentioned on the 20th of August 2023 in the 861st Contact Report, but which I would like to mention and list again as a reminder. The monument had writings on it in several languages, pointing out and publicizing that the Earth was easily designed for only 500 million human beings. Here, I have the article and the picture that reported on it again. In the picture you can see the monument after the sectarian destruction, which cost quite a lot of money to build, which was morbidly and stupidly labeled as satanic by a sectarian.
The Georgia Guidestones explosion is also still a mystery years later. Uncut News. Cannes, 14th August 2023.
More than a year has passed since the mysterious explosion at the Georgia Guidestones in the USA. The police still have no suspects in their sights and no arrests have been made. On the morning of the 6th of July 2022, a surveillance camera filmed how someone drove towards the controversial monument with an object and then sped off at full speed. A few moments later, several cameras recorded an explosion. Later that day, the rest of the monument was also destroyed for security reasons. Built in 1980, the memorial is considered one of America's greatest secrets. Since its construction, it has been associated with conspiracy theories. Messages to future generations were written on the pillars. In 12 world languages, they called for the world population to be kept below 500 million. This in order to achieve an eternal balance with nature. Candace Taylor, candidate for governor of Georgia, called the monument satanic.
The majority of Earth humans who never control and fight the abnormal and evil and the unworthy of man in themselves in such a way, in order to become true human beings and towards all life, and thus not only with regard to human beings, but also with regard to all fauna and flora, and thus all existence and power of creation on planet Earth and in the extensive universal realm, will never attain true humanity, but will remain in the filth of meanness, the unworthy of life, depravity, discord, insane indifference, and in the snare of corruption, wickedness, depravity, and the evil neglect of truth and denial of truth. If everything in reality is carefully considered, analyzed, and foreseen, and as it results from the majority of Earth humans, as well as from the worldwide majority of unrighteous rulers in future times, who constantly cut and harass the minority of righteous co-rulers, they will therefore never consciously become true human beings in life. This is because, consequently, the majority of Earthlings, in their indifference, allow the might of that part of the like-minded in governments to do what suits them and what they want. This means quite clearly that nothing leads to the better, and not actually conscious of an educationally evolutive, and nothing leads to true humanity. Nothing is changed and nothing evolutive is also done. This is not because the indifference in the majority of humanity and, of course, also the behavior of power in the majority of rulers is so unrighteously ingrained that, as the saying goes, hops and malt are lost for an improvement, in such a way that nothing worthwhile and progressive is formed, and the true human being cannot effectively become a reality. To call the majority of rulers correct is truly to call them a club of misrulers and power addicts who oppress the part of the truly righteous in government, although they govern rightly and want to do and achieve the best for the peoples, but who want to be insulted, cut, despised, denied, and also maliciously ousted from politics by the unrighteous in government. Therefore, if, as I have said, no real evolutionary progress is achieved in terms of true humanity among the good majority of Earth humans, and the good majority of those in power, then, with the best will in the world, only a minority of humanity can be called Homo sapiens, or Homo of the mind. Homo of the mind, but not the majority of Earthlings, especially not the majority of scientists and rulers, from which unfortunately only a minority can be excluded, who react or try to want to react to what is of correctness and truth, and who are powerful of righteous knowledge, reason, wisdom, prudence, cleverness, and righteousness, and who can be spoken of as Homo sapiens and who can also be appreciated and honored as such. The majority of Earth humans is the opposite of Homo sapiens, which unfortunately also includes the majority of rulers, who as a rule often oppress their co-rulers or the righteous minority with violence, lies and deceit as well as with vile vilification, and this majority as a whole is not to be counted as belonging to the homo of understanding. If their religious and worldly beliefs and their pseudo-thinking as well as their actions are analyzed and judged, then everything they do, live and behave, etc., correctly corresponds to the true designation Homo stultus, and thus to a designation that is far removed from logic, understanding, and reason. Expressed in correspondingly correct words, the unworthiness of human being of silliness, human being of arrogance, human being of low intelligence, that is to say, human being of non-thinking, human being of simplicity, human being of foolishness, human being of murder and killing, human being of foolishness, and ultimately also Homo brutus, is clearly appropriate. Of boredom and sluggishness as well as of trickery, deceit, betrayal, violence, discord and murder as well as of deliberate lies, deceit and dullness, etc. And the fact that the terms Homo stultus and Homo brutus have their justification, validity, and correctness today among the majority of Earth humans and the majority of rulers, as well as a very specific breed of scientists and inventors of futuristic technologies, is proven by the fact that, compared to the majority of humanity as a whole, only a minority goes through life in righteousness without religious and worldly faith in accordance with effective reality and its truth, and honestly endeavors to be true human beings. This is how we teach and spread this in the Figu, how it is learnt and applied by righteous human beings and Figu members worldwide in relation to themselves, and how it is also passed on by them to interested fellow human beings in the form of teaching, which has brought pleasing success worldwide, as people from all over the world are increasingly thankfully reporting to me, who have become free within themselves through the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, and have found the correct path in life and thus peace within themselves. Even if the traditional teaching of Nocademian is spread worldwide by the Figu, even though spreading it only brings meager success, it still brings success. This is also despite the fact that the majority of humanity is banal and indifferent and does not want to work on itself and become truly human, and that consequently only a minority wants to see reality and truth and live according to it. All the evils that prevail here on earth and in human beings, just as the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life can only be lived meagerly. Nevertheless, it is so successful that individual human beings endeavor to absorb the teaching and integrate it into themselves. The result is that they feel freer and more peaceful within themselves and towards fellow human beings and creation, which is nothing other than nature and all its existence. energy and power in a universe-wide form, and therefore not an imaginary god or saint, and that they become more human, feel freer and more open-minded and more joyful about life. All this is very urgently needed if we take note of everything that happens in the world through human beings. How countless marriages are characterized by daily quarrels and fights. How these also often end in murder and manslaughter, or how spouses and also children in hospitals have to be saved from death or nursed back to health. But there is also murder and manslaughter through crime and criminal behavior of all kinds, as well as through addiction to intoxicating drugs of all kinds, from alcohol and natural poisons to the worst chemical and addictive drugs. But all this is surpassed by the states, namely by the military and the wars that are waged by them, and the armies and soldiers are turned into state-sanctioned murderers. And if the human beings called up for this do not go to war voluntarily, then many are forced to do so. In war, they then murder and destroy, which ultimately gives rise to joy and an urge to murder and destroy in many, turning them into passionate murderers who consequently devote themselves to murder with absolute passionate enthusiasm, eagerly and unscrupulously. Once again, I have said everything I thought and needed to say on this subject.
Yes, but everything is of correctness. And unfortunately also outside our federation of this kind, not everything is as it should be. Consequently, peace is therefore not maintained cosmos-wide in our ANKAR universe in such a way that it would be constant. Because life forms of human-like and non-human nature not belonging to our federation, as well as foreign solar planetary systems, are very well uncomfortable contemporaries, as you call unpeaceful groupings in each case. But
I am afraid I have to interrupt you there, Quetzal, because what our friend has said is indeed extremely interesting and instructive for me. However, his speech has taken some time, which is why I am now short of time, as I have to get back to my duties. But what you have said and explained, my friend, has added to my knowledge of the history of the living conditions of Earth humans, and also much more, for which I thank you. However, as I must now hurry, I must explain that we have so far endeavored in vain to bring those energies and their forces under control, by which you, my friend, are infamously and violently hindered in your work. It is true that the energies and their forces act independently through their swinging waves, but these are generated by the outlandish and delusional religious belief and the delusional prayer to a non-existent God, which together, through all the similarly delusional believers of the whole earth, creates an energy power and energy force in a very short time, which spreads like lightning earthwide and brings the delusional to effect and begins to have a strongly detrimental and even malicious effect against everything that counteracts this energy and power. Further, however, it is to be explained that this energy and its power are associated with delusional imaginations, which add to the pathological delusions of faith of those who are addicted to religious belief worldwide, and increase this delusional faith immeasurably. In this way, it even leads to effectively recognizable plastic fantasy phenomena, as well as also to visible and effectively audible imaginary phenomena, which can become truly auditory or audible. That is to say, how they are perceived orally and acoustically or sonically seem to degenerate and appear like real perceptions.
Aha, if I may interrupt you. Arlian! From this or from what you explain regarding the auditory, it emerges for me an understanding, as I learnt from Svath, that this is directly related to the sensory perception of acoustic perception. Namely in such a way that, under certain circumstances or really, the sensory perception of sound and therefore also of hearing are interdependent, even when an acoustic fantasy phenomenon occurs. The whole process of perception takes place via sensory cells, which in the case we are talking about are stimulated by sound waves or swinging waves that are picked up from the environment. The human being's sense of hearing is of central importance to him, as it serves him not only to perceive what is going on acoustically in his environment, but primarily to communicate with fellow human beings, and thus to be able to communicate with them. I also want to mention that Svath, That was Quetzal's grandfather. If you do not know, taught me all sorts of things that I am not supposed to talk about, such as how he also blocked something in my brain that even hypnosis or some futuristic technical intervention cannot release any of the things I am supposed to keep quiet about. Perhaps you have been informed about this?
Of course, I know that also regarding the foreigners, as you call them,
Excuse me for interrupting again after all, but these are not to be spoken of. Even Svath insisted on it. What I can say is the following. They, the foreigners, have been coming to Earth for thousands of years, and therefore have a futuristic technology, at least for the Earthlings, which is far inferior to that of the Pleiaren, and that of the ancient emigrants and those who have lived in the DL universe since time immemorial. The foreigners, whose flying apparatus have been whizzing through the earthly skies as UFOs since time immemorial, have technology far superior to that of the human beings of Earth. But they are all ignorant of other creation universes, and so they also have no knowledge of the Ankar universe and the sevenfold nature of creation. What they are aware of, as Svath said, is only the knowledge of the dimensions of this universe. That is to say, the past and the future, but also only to a limited extent, as well as regarding higher technical finesse, which, however, but I'm not allowed to say more.
I am aware of all that. Yes.
Excuse me, but I wanted to say a few more things. Namely, what Svath taught me regarding the belief-based energies and forces through which manifestations occur that are completely misjudged and misunderstood by human beings. And all this leads back to how I was able to fathom with Svath the beginnings of the whole of religions, when very early foreigners, who also mingled with human beings on Earth, acted as rulers. And because they were able to move through the air, both technically and through levitation, the still early Earthlings became humble towards the foreigners, who were regarded as heavenly beings, and also as heavenly beings, and were worshipped to the point of fanaticism to such an extent that they were called and regarded as Gailel in a primitive language. This term was understood by the early Earthlings in question to mean the creation of all things, or nature, and thus creation, which was correct. However, because the Earth humans assumed that the foreigners were the ones who had created everything due to their technology and skills, they also assumed that they were the ones who had created the entire visible expanse, that is to say the universe, and all the stars, etc. So the term Gailel was coined. So the term Gailel was used by the primitive people as creation, so to speak, in which Svath and I explored the beginnings of faith. The term God, however, was only conceived thousands of years later, by human beings who had already evolved. But the term only changed more and only then became a term when a visible great evolution took hold among the human beings of the Earth, whereby this term was ultimately handed down in many forms in many different languages and spread with the faith. However, everything developed into a faith-based fear, namely of suffering punishment if the faith was not honored. This inevitably deepened the belief in human beings that worshipful recognition was to be shown to powerful foreigners, in the form of profound faith and unreserved recognition, which is controlled by adoration or by thoughts and feelings, and which evokes an uncontrollable admiration and a yes to faith and everything connected with it, which usually leads uncontrollably to a fanatical form that vehemently rejects all reality and truth. Depending on its nature, this ultimately led to like-minded human beings coming together, who began to practice a group or also individual fearful but at the same time fanatically devout worshipping recognition and adoration of fearful praise, reverence and respect, etc., whereby a first form of religion came into being, depending on the nature of what was adopted as a form of faith. Svath explained to me in detail that these energies and their forces, which have been increasing drastically since then, ultimately arose and continue to arise through the religious beliefs of human beings, and are being deposited worldwide, and also proved this through experiments and real-life occurrences. However, the fact that these energies have been hindering me in my work for a long time since the 1960s is simply crazy. Although I know how to defend myself against these energies so that their swinging waves do not affect my health to such an extent that I would suffer from them, the fact that they can now also have an extremely negative influence on computer technology is mind-boggling. The human beings of the earth have become believers, to the point of fanaticism, and have thus been creating religious energies since time immemorial, which have not only spread and accumulated more and more worldwide, but have also repeatedly caused mischief all over the earth in all peoples, with the worst of all evils being religious wars and hate wars, wars of revenge and wars of hegemony, as well as criminality and crime. This, as well as quarreling, hatred, revenge, robbery, murder, and manslaughter, which is also common in our own families, as spouses murder the other, as do children. Pedophilia and prostitution have become the order of the day, as have also lies and fraud, like all evil in general. However, these energies of faith and their tremendous powers have existed for thousands of years. Ever since the Earthlings became addicted to a belief in various forms as a result of the foreigners they believed to be Gylos or gods, and this delusion of faith has survived to this day and has been deposited worldwide, causing and continuing to cause tremendous evil. Since time immemorial, belief has always ultimately been based on religion, not so much on worldly faith, and leads to completely crazy manifestations. Even back then, when the first human being believed he was seeing a higher being when he saw something he was unable to interpret. These result from religious belief, which is already traditional and therefore ancient among Earthlings, and which arose and continues to arise through the delusion of human beings' beliefs, which triggers energy-swinging waves that are not only deposited and constantly multiplied, but which also trigger effects that then appear as a wide variety of manifestations. And since religious belief is defined by good and evil, in other words, by heaven and hell and then by God and the devil, everything is immediately and unquestioningly attributed to an imaginary Satan or devil. If something abnormal happens that exceeds the norms of normality, these negative energies of faith are immediately and unhesitatingly blamed on the non-existent devil in his imaginary shoes, and this non-existent devil is then held responsible for everything. We have had enough evidence of this since ancient times, when many human beings were killed as a result of this delusional belief because they were supposedly in league with the devil, witches and sorcerers and others, who were simply galvanized out of hatred, revenge or superstition and then cruelly executed. Now, the manifestations of the ever-increasing faith energy vibrations, the more that the Earthlings are active in folding their hands and believing in the imaginary God, are causing them to grow into elemental and tremendous might and power, which are uninhibitedly effective and growing ever stronger. And indeed, the energies of faith have become a tremendous might on earth through the religious believers, which are deposited all over the world and cause visible and audible phenomena, just as they often have a visible and audible effect worldwide, but also act in such a way that they infest human beings, animals and creatures, and cause them to go crazy, so that exorcism is then performed on human beings because they are supposed to be possessed by the devil or Satan.
I wanted to enlighten you about this, but I did not realize that you had already acquired the necessary knowledge about this knowledge of this in your adolescent years through instruction from Svath. That saves me many words and necessary explanations. I have only to explain to you that from now on, we will endeavor to test something that can contain the evil and destruction that is hindering you in your work. Our trial will probably months, during which we will create a domain of resistance to the energies in the immediate vicinity of your area of activity. To erect a domain of resistance to the energies in the immediate vicinity of your area of activity, so that you will no longer be able to call up your conversations. Because this will also fundamentally decimate the harmful high energies, so that absolutely none of these forms are able to penetrate the domain of resistance. Unfortunately, however, this also prevents the passage of all other high energies that you need to enable you to receive the dialogue facts required and guided by callings, and guided conversational skills. Consequently, we will endeavor to ensure that you can still record this conversation today by having Florina and Bermuda assist you in a direct, wise way. Possibly also Quetzal and N, possibly also Quetzal and Njana, with Quetzal recording everything that is said today. This will then be dictated to you by them dictated to you, whereby you have to translate everything into the High German language that you are familiar with. because we are having our conversation in your mother tongue, as you also always do when you are in contact. It is,
Excuse me, that is all good and well, but it is still much more time-consuming than if I were to call everything up, translate it into German and write it down. It works for once, but in the long term it is not a solution.
that is probably the case, but unfortunately it cannot be changed. It is the way it is now, because we have now, through protracted, to get to the bottom of the problem and find a solution so that the vibrations of the religious energies that affect you at work, swinging waves of religious energies, can no longer attack you at work. As a result, you can no longer access and record this conversation as usual, but only with the help of Quetzal, Florina, Bermuda, and Enjana, as I have explained to you. They are all also good at using your computer if necessary, so they can also help you in this way if you need their help. But the fact that they will help you to record this conversation will only be a one-time help. Because, as you said yourself, it is very time-consuming, and it is not possible all the time because they all have their duties to attend to. And with that, my friend, I have done my task and must now leave, for I have already missed my duties by a span of time. When I will come back again when I have time. But for now, farewell, Edward.
And he is gone. I could not even say goodbye. I actually wanted to talk to him because you told me that he's interested in the foreigners and their technology, and is secretly trying to find out about some of them. Whether he knows how far they have come in terms of their flying apparatus and propulsion. Ages ago, it was times ago, some quite strange vehicles moved through the Earth's skies, both in terms of their shapes and also their propulsion systems. And propulsion systems, as there were some that somehow still breathed fire. Today, however, and this is very interesting for me when I see that the so-called UFOs, as the Earthlings call their flying apparatus, are only objects that move that whiz through the atmosphere at lightning speed, and no longer have fire trails as they did in the early days. Quite obviously, these objects also have high-performance gravity absorbers, and therefore have no problems with Earth's gravity suit. No problems. If I now compare their flying apparatus with your beam ships, then despite the fire, some of them were also not strange and non-fire-breathing flying objects, and even in prehistoric times they had something like some kind of anti-gravity drives. Anti-gravity drives, as you also have in your beam ships. These drives are purely energetic and not like terrestrial airplanes of all kinds, which consume fuel that is extracted from the earth in the form of petroleum and is catastrophically polluting the air. Polluting and poisoning the air, and also effectively driving the climate to change. As I remember from Svat's teachings, petroleum is not only very toxic, but also pollutes and changes the air when it is burned. And also dangerously changes the air when it is burned, just as it poisons the water when it gets into it. One drop of petroleum alone poisons more than 500 liters of water if it gets into it. You can calculate what has happened in this respect since the first offshore oil drilling platform was built in 1897 too. Note from Wikipedia research, Count Alfred von Hammerstein, 1870 to 1941, who arrived in the region of Alberta, Canada in 1897, mined the Athabasca oil sands for more than 40 years, and photographed them with descriptive titles such as intermediate sand and flowing asphalt. And flowing asphaltum in the Athabasca district, which are now in the National Library and National Archives of Canada. Library and the National Archives of Canada. The mining, which actually takes place onshore, was still called offshore at the time.
What is that offshore?
Offshore is actually a term that simply says off the coast. For example, when something is being built there, that something is being built off the coast, in the sea, like an oil rig. The first offshore oil well was just an oil tapping rig, whereas a correct offshore platform is a structure or an artificial base installed in the sea for a drilling platform or a drilling rig. But such a platform is used on the one hand to search for, and on the other hand to extract petroleum and natural gas. The first one to be built was constructed by the Soviet Union in 1948, and this was the so-called first offshore drilling platform to be built in the Caspian Sea. What has happened since then has been a terrible environmental pollution, because to this day, many such drilling platforms have exploded again and again, spilling billions of liters of petroleum into the oceans and poisoning them. For example, the oil platform or drilling rig Deepwater Horizon exploded in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, triggering an oil slick because only careless maintenance work was being carried out. In addition to the fact that 11 human beings lost their lives, they were buried in the sea forever and were never found. Around 1 billion liters of petroleum then flowed into the sea of the Gulf of Mexico over 87 days. This was the largest known marine catastrophe to date, that is to say, around 250 million liters more than the Ixtok Y explosion. And oil rig explosions occurred again and again. For example, an oil rig explosion was reported in 1979, and then also in 1991 in the Gulf of Persia, and various others. As a result of the petroleum in the oceans, the population of marine life, many species of fish, mussels, crabs, plankton and sponges, etc., and countless birds were severely decimated in some areas and could only recover with difficulty and sluggishly. Others were even driven to the brink of extinction, which also damaged tourism because the beaches were contaminated by petroleum. In 1991, for example, the giant oil spill in the Persian Gulf damaged the seas and beaches of southern Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, because the sea currents and wind drove the petroleum many hundreds of kilometers towards these countries, and it will be many decades before everything returns to normal. Large percentages of mangroves and salt marshes off the Arabian coast died quickly or within a few years. What remains is still severely damaged. The bottom-dwelling organisms were also killed off, and the contaminated areas became a habitat only for cyanobacteria, which seal the seabed with an airtight layer. As a result, the oil deposited underneath can no longer be extracted, which would mean that the cyanobacteria layer would have to be artificially destroyed. New drains would also have to be laid, as this alone would make real renaturalization possible. But this is illusory, as it would be too problematic to move the deposited oil, because in the waters of the Persian Gulf there is little movement and therefore little surf, as well as weak ocean currents, which is why the deposited petroleum cannot or can hardly be degraded for centuries. Of course, it was not just the toxic emissions from airplanes that caused the greenhouse effect and thus the climate collapse, because the entire shipping industry with its giant ships was equally involved, as was agriculture with its motorized machinery, as were motorsports enthusiasts and the people in general with all the toxins of all kinds that they released into the atmosphere. And the more human beings were bred, the more the atmosphere was polluted with toxins. The heat was increased, and thus the climate was affected to such an extent that it overturned and changed in such a way that now global climate change is causing storms, destruction, and countless deaths of human beings and animals. This is in addition to the fact that, through the fault of massive overpopulation, all of the world's waters are contaminated with all kinds of toxins. Just as the oceans are contaminated with the finest plastic particles, which are ingested by all aquatic life, some of which die miserably. Other toxins of all kinds also enter the water, especially the oceans, such as the toxin that causes biofouling, the growth on the hull of a ship against which a toxic paint is painted, which dissolves over the course of a few years and releases the toxin into the water. Algae and other aquatic organisms of all kinds and species attach themselves to the hulls of ships and are a major problem for shipping, as they slow down the speed of the ships and also cause great damage, as I experienced when I worked as a boat painter on a smaller ship in the Mediterranean for 6 weeks. The antidote is paint, which is also highly toxic and releases its poison back into the water over a short period of time, poisoning aquatic life and causing them to die miserably. And when you consider that around 70% of the earth is mostly covered in salt water, but what human beings do with it and poison everything through their might, including the glaciers and ice of the Arctic and Antarctic poles, lakes, rivers, streams, and rivulets, then it is no wonder that the rare drinking water also contains poison and is no longer pure and clean. Of all the existing water on Earth, only about 1% can really be used by human beings for food, etc. But agriculture and horticulture take a huge amount of this, and a large proportion is also used for the care of human beings, such as showering, bathing, brushing teeth, washing the body, washing clothes, washing cars, etc., and if possible with chemical detergents. And it should be borne in mind that this mere 1% of all vital water for human beings, animals, creatures, and the whole of nature and its fauna and flora is becoming increasingly scarce. But Earth humans in their indifference do not care. On the contrary, they are breeding their overpopulation even further and making everything worse and more precarious. On the one hand, this is due to the religious delusion of go forth and multiply. And because the many religious bigwigs can pocket horrendous salaries as a result, the murderer organization's armies, the economy, and the entire financial system are booming. But also, wars are being waged and the breeding of human beings as cannon fodder, as well as the exercise of might, revenge, retribution, murder, and manslaughter, etc. is guaranteed. Well, that is what is going through my skull right now. Do you at least have time to answer what I asked about flying objects and their propulsion, which was just in reference to foreigners?
I have Arlion to ask about that, because he's dealing with it. But I should also be back to my duties soon. But I still have some time left until then.
Good, thank you. Then this, on the morning of 29.11. 24. I had to go to Weislingen to see Dr. Cordish when Eva drove me there in her car. I saw a bright yellow object about 1 kilometer to the left of the morning star at a very high altitude of approximately 5 or 6 kilometers in the sky. It was exactly 7.10 Millie, but Ava could not see it because she would have had to look up under the windscreen, which she could not do because she had to drive the car. So I watched the object alone and asked her several times if she could see it after all, which was possible at 7.27 when we were able to drive on the road in such a way that the object came into her field of vision so that she could see it. However, this only lasted a few seconds, after which the object lit up brightly, became almost 3 times as large as it originally was, and then disappeared without a trace in a flash, after which the morning star could still be seen, which of course Eva also saw. It really was a special occurrence. And it was about the same as when Guido and I were concreting in the 1970s, and we saw the same object flying over the mountain of the Army's Bloodhound missile station. It was about the same size and had the same bright yellow metallic color.
Nothing is known to me regarding this, because neither Bermunda, myself, nor Florina and Injana were here in Europe at that time of 29th November, but in the Middle East, because we had some things to observe and also record there.
Aha, there is no peace there because this mass murderer and war criminal Netanyahu wants to exterminate the Arabs, so he will also try to establish himself in Syria. And the fact that the hostages are not released by Hamas and are slowly dying, as has already happened several times, and also that the prisoners are being tortured, that is all the fault of this mass killer.
I guess there is no argument with that, but now my time is really up for me to continue our conversation, because I really have to go now.
Then I will not keep you any longer. So take care and goodbye, my friend.
Well then, goodbye, Edward.
Sprinkles from the Correspondence. 7. By Bernadette Brand.
Time and again, questions arise in the correspondence that are related to the false image and unrealistic hopes that many readers and those interested in creation energy teaching have regarding their next personality and its goals. These are wishful thinking, such as that they absolutely want to become a man or a woman in the next life, or that they are looking for a way to have a guarantee for themselves that their next personality will come into contact with the teachings again, and so on. All considerations in this direction are based on esoteric fairy tales about an alleged rebirth that have no relevance to the facts. What also comes up again and again are our own behaviors and questions about personal developments, which are sometimes based on false assumptions or which cannot be correctly classified by our own thinking because certain aspects are not considered. However, sometimes I also receive extremely remarkable statements, such as the one I quote at the very end of this sprinkle.
Question: how can I book the ticket for the personality that will come after me to remain part of the Figu project?
Answer: regarding the Figu project, I believe that if the human being makes an honest effort to learn, which he should usually do, which of course he will not always succeed in doing, but at least often if he makes an honest effort, he will then have created the best template for the next personality that will be animated by his energies. The human being can and should do his best to reflect on everything he reads, experiences, sees, and hears and make up his own mind about it. Life does not always allow human beings to do what they actually want to do, because they will often have to forego certain wish fulfillments and decide according to reason. Over time, he will learn to master certain situations and change his behavior in accordance with creation energy teaching, even if this can sometimes be very difficult and the success is only marginal. In this wise, he will slowly move step by step towards the goal of becoming a true human being. The human being will develop a growing strength or greater energy from these efforts, which will then at some point in the future animate a newly conceived human being, a new personality. What they will then do with this greater energy, and how they will decide to use it, is not in our hands and cannot be influenced by us in any wise, because they will be just as free in their decisions as we were and as every human being is. The crux of the matter is that this coming new personality, which will be energized by our energies, will simply be the beneficiary of the power and knowledge that we have built up and achieved for ourselves in this life. How this coming personality will use this power, and whether it will be able to use it at all, will be determined by many different factors that we can neither guess nor foresee in our current life, because it will have to orientate its life and its goals in accordance with the possibilities, circumstances, and conditions into which it is born and which are then given. The only thing we can hope for is that she will be given the opportunity and will be wise enough to honor the ticket that we have given her with our grown creation life energy, and that she may continue on the same path. If she does not do this, there is absolutely nothing we can do about it, because as a human being, she will be free to make her own decisions as far as her time and circumstances allow. What we can be absolutely certain of, however, is that if the next personality fails for whatever reason, some later personality will return to the path and continue on it, because evolution cannot be stopped, even if it sometimes takes unforeseen turns.
Question: I like to take time to think about everything, and that explains my silence. I tend to think that a good word is one that is carefully considered.
Response: it is a very good quality of yours that you take time to think about everything and draw your own conclusions. In this wise, your word will gain weight the older and more experienced you become, and the more thoughtfully you speak and act. Being concise and getting to the heart of what needs to be said is also a desirable quality, as this skill, which you need to develop, also requires a lot of thought and clear and structured consideration. It is absolutely not a bad quality to think everything through for yourself and to find the answers to your own questions yourself, because this approach is the most fruitful and valuable of all, because it is precisely tailored to your own insights, your own level of knowledge, and your own needs. As a result, it does not allow you to simply believe something because you are told it, but requires you to think and work through everything yourself, which ultimately leads to deeper and more correct insights than if you simply accept what has been said or explained per se.
Question: it was terribly embarrassing for me at the time, and I still feel uncomfortable about it, but I also know that I provoked this reaction in this matter. I have considered the answer carefully again and again, and have always come to the same conclusion. It is not possible that I was offended by it, because the response was chosen with care and with the intention of educating a fallible human being.
Response: it always happens that things embarrass us when we are unexpectedly confronted with our thoughtless behavior. But this is not really bad. It is often very effective and fruitful, because the feeling of embarrassment stimulates thinking and helps us to analyze everything and learn not to make the same mistake another time. And if we manage to do that, then that is a great success after all. On the other hand, it is important to remember that there is very little we can hold against other human beings, because we all make more or less the same mistakes throughout our lives, just at different times and under different aspects and circumstances. The only difference is whether something constructive is learnt from the mistakes or not. Pointing something out to someone clearly and bluntly has nothing to do with wanting to offend them, but is an endeavor to make something clear to the other person that can help them in their future life, if they accept it and think about it. Personally, I think it is a great bad habit and ultimately a great cowardice to try to say something to others diplomatically or through the flower, because this only leads to what is said not being received and accepted because it lacks the strength it needs to be really heard due to the weak expression. In addition, diplomatic paraphrasing can unsettle the person addressed because they do not know exactly what is actually being criticized, and this only leads to unnecessary and stressful irritation. This by no means means that what is to be said is thrown at the person addressed in a rude, hurtful, offensive, and indecent manner, but that what is to be said is simply said clearly and openly. So, if necessary, you should always talk straight, which means that something is said openly, without false consideration, and the situation is presented quite openly, which ensures that the message is also received correctly and is not misunderstood or misinterpreted. Apart from that, I do not think much of trying to educate other human beings, because every adult human being should educate themselves through insight, self-love, and their will to want to do better.
Question: I realized this connection to Figu and creation energy teaching at earlier times when I was still an adolescent, and it is an unmistakable and unshakable path that I follow. There is no greater goal and nothing more noble than to dedicate one's life for the conscious progress of humanity. And it is truly a privilege and an honor to be part of this mission and to recognize its echoes from earlier times. I am not one of the many who are drowning in the confusion of the zeitgeist that I find so bizarre and frightening, when the truth is so clearly visible and nourishing.
Response: ultimately, it is each human being's own decision as to what they consider important and worthwhile. And we have to accept that decision, just as our environment also has to accept our decisions regarding our own development. In my view, it is a great privilege that we owe to ourselves if we recognize what is really important in life, and if we manage to align ourselves accordingly, which sometimes involves great challenges, but which ultimately enrich us and make us more mature.
Question: last year, I was able to find a reserve of energy that allowed me to work for hours without feeling hungry or the need for breaks, but that is no longer possible for me at the moment. It was wonderful. It was such a highly focused state of consciousness where all time disappeared and only pure connectedness. And contentment remained as I worked on these things for the mission, and it seemed to release waves of energy where time disappeared. But for a few months now, I cannot trigger that anymore, so I am a little stumped on how to get myself back into that state.
Response: do not forget that all learning and all of life is always in flux, and that nothing ever stays the same as it is right now. Because everything will and must evolve and change, and often enough, these changes simply demand patience until it can be recognized in which direction they are trending. Sometimes the unconscious and the subconscious also simply need a certain amount of time and a period of rest to sort out and process the implicit knowledge. And in these phases, it may well be that certain things do not work out as well as hoped and expected. But this will certainly recover over time, as soon as everything inside is ripe for a further step, and for new insights and new paths that open up the possibility for implicit knowledge to penetrate to the outside and become explicit knowledge that enables us to tackle further evolutionary steps. The important thing is not to lose sight of the goal and to endeavor from time to time to return to this state, which will succeed as soon as the internal processes are complete and ready to show themselves to the outside world in order to initiate a new learning step. Remarkable extract from an email. Billy and creation energy teaching have inspired me incredibly deeply over the last 6+ years. At the same time, I have noticed that my inner self has developed in a very good and positive way since my official FIGU passive membership, and especially since my personal involvement in the center since last year. The work on site and the contact with the human beings at the center have a profound influence on me and contribute significantly to my personal development. Sprinkles from the Correspondence 8 by Bernadette Brand. For longer and longer, everyone is talking about AI, and while some believe they can see the dawn of a carefree future, others fear an impending superstorm that threatens to destroy everything. In any case, the current developments are giving rise to questions that are bothering many human beings and leaving them no peace of mind, as can be seen from a recent email sent to me.
Question: I would like to ask what limits we need to set ourselves when using AI. Specifically, what principles, criteria, or parameters should we use to regulate ourselves? But I would like to simplify things. According to my concept idea, I must only be a support and not replace my work. Otherwise, I will become lowly intelligent. I would also like to add that I am not inclined to let AA take on high-level tasks that I do not know how to do myself. For example, how to write a book or compose music. What do you think about that?
Response: The problem that arises from AI is the fact that it does a lot of things for human beings, especially tasks and challenges of a mental nature that human beings should actually be able to do on their own and through their own thinking. Many of the things that AI and electronics have made possible for human beings have simplified life so much that many are no longer able to do without the recommendations and use their own thinking power for certain tasks or work. The human being relies on information from Google, Wikipedia, and other knowledge portals, for example, and is happy that he no longer has to spend hours poring over heavy encyclopedias and reference books, but has the information he needs quickly and, above all, at his fingertips. Such offers are extremely convenient, and because the information can be accessed at any time, it is also no longer absolutely necessary to memorize it and create certain connections through your own thinking, or to reflect on or deepen what you have read. Because the quick access to any kind of information makes your own thinking largely superfluous, which ultimately has an absolutely negative effect on the power of thought and the ability to think. A distinction should be made between pure electronics, which for its part can take on certain tasks that make our work moderately easier, such as adding up long series of numbers or organizing endless lists, etc., and actual AI, which is already self-thinking to a certain extent and will be fully capable of this in the future. It will therefore be quite capable of feeding human beings with false information in the future, which they, due to their laziness and inability to think acquired through the incorrect use of electronics and their conveniences, will ultimately simply believe, thereby forfeiting their independence, maturity, and autonomy as human beings, and replacing them with superficiality, convenience, and disinterest. Because of their seductiveness, human beings no longer offer any resistance and simply push reason and rationality aside in favor of an unhealthy and dangerous belief that the AI-generated answers and information are true, and that they therefore no longer question them and also no longer check them, which ultimately makes them dependent and a pawn of external influences. Of course, both electronics and AI can and may be used, and it is up to each human being to decide to what extent they utilize these possibilities. As long as human beings exercise the necessary caution and are aware that these futuristic technologies are purely working tools and nothing more than aids that enable them to carry out their own tasks efficiently while retaining full mental and conscious control. There is nothing to stop them from using these tools responsibly. However, they should not be used to create unnecessary relief that merely serves one's own convenience and laziness of thought, making one's own thinking and reflection superfluous, because that is the point at which thought work is neglected, and the use of electronics, and even more so, AI leads to a collapse and eventual loss of thinking power and conscious awareness, which, like any muscle, need to be constantly exercised, giving way to thoughtlessness and stupidity that can no longer be reversed. More important than any physical exercise, which of course must not be disregarded, is the conscious care and constant training of one's own ability to think, which, far from any belief, must be trained and actively maintained on the basis of reality and self-explored facts and realities. This requires insight, understanding, reason, understanding, logic, and foresight, which should be learnt step by step and developed into reliable parameters. The more time progresses and the further human beings advance into their future, the more important it becomes that they learn at an early age to stay away from beliefs of any kind and to think and live independently and autonomously. The following interesting letter, which Billy received on 22nd.12.24, was sent to him by a pastor. On the counseling of Quetzal, to whom Billy naturally brought the letter to his attention, the letter is published together with the current contact report, with the consent of the person writing, of course. The 21st.12, 2024.
Or Billy, finally. Once again, a direct sign of life from indirectly, the weighty wisdom with which you have been delighting Earth humans for an infinitely long time accompanies me practically around the HRs. You even put up with all the countless harassments, to put it mildly. It is hard to imagine what you have had to endure, and for some time now people have even been trying to tyrannically destroy the essence of your written work. Sometimes it seems that human beings are not becoming freer, but are being led more and more blatantly like sheep into the abyss by authorities. When you talk to your friends, especially Pa and Quetzal at the moment, I think I can also sense a deep sadness in you. What you have gone through and are still going through with the property in that Hintish Midruti pains me greatly. Not least because it is also unbearable how arrogantly people from the authorities often behave just because they feel entitled as officials and at the same time cannot bear the fact that the people they accuse are far superior to them in every respect and have much more knowledge. Unfortunately, this is then compensated for in the worst possible way, and the innocent are discriminated against. And I talked a lot about how it came about that the Swiss population also wanted to adapt more and more to the great powers, especially after 1960, when the Swiss population was doing better and better. The Swiss population could have fulfilled a more important task than indulging in the great power lust that incomprehensibly persists to this day. What? Said spontaneously on 9 November 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, has been ringing in my ears ever since. Now 1989 would be the time for NATO to also dissolve, because otherwise we will sooner or later have wars again. The Americans will do what is necessary for this. As far as I know, Russia will have done an infinite amount by T2. We already have Gorbachev to thank for the soul of the Berlin Wall. And if Khrushchev had not listened to President John F. Kennedy in 1963 and withdrawn the troops, which Kennedy also did, things could have turned out disastrously even then. During the presidency of Boris Yeltsin from June to 1, who was more drunk than sober, The oligarchs were able to enrich themselves like in a self-service shop, and the Russians continued to fare correspondingly miserably. However, the change to Putin opened up new prospects for Europe. With the necessary mutual respect for the different natures of the individual countries, peaceful market economy cooperation could have been achieved, especially with the Germany-orientated Putin. Instead, this statesman was met with disdainful arrogance. The Russian offers were torpedoed, and what had been negotiated mendaciously was turned into the opposite. Unfortunately, as far as I know, Imperial America was behind this. Over there, a different plan was already in place when the wall came down. The Europeans, who were already orientated towards America, allowed themselves to be drawn in, and the fear of Russia continued to be subtly stirred up among the population, right up to the classrooms and kindergartens. America, which was far away and heavily in debt, wanted to prevent Europeans and Russians from maintaining a market economy relationship at all costs. The probably even justified fear was too great of losing its supremacy as a result. The mainstream press is silent about this, but is telling the believing people a story about the Nord Stream 2 blast that could hardly be more lowly intelligent. The sinister plan that was implemented has worked splendidly, and the originators have since been able to deliver their expensive fracked gas overseas, as planned. Nobody really knows what to make of the Ukrainian alleged amateurs. It is simply ridiculous if it were not so serious and sad. However, the fact that our Federal Council effectively dissolved Switzerland a few days after 22nd February 2022 is something I can hardly cope with to this day. Even though, and I, like you in particular, dear Billy, have had to experience and endure a lot of bad things in our home country, and still have to. What the Federal Council has done with Zelensky since then is a pathetic lack of tact for Switzerland. Yesterday, Friday 2024, the 7 traitors to the country gave their de facto final approval to the EU submission treaty, and today Mrs. the head of the EU is even traveling to Bern to do so. Switzerland is being declared a colony of the EU that can hardly be surpassed in terms of corruption. In addition, Mrs. the fact that NATO is an organization that only serves the Americans was recently clearly demonstrated by Thomas Roper in one of his articles. I am sure that I am currently collecting signatures for the Compass Initiative so that the people have the final say on the colonial treaty, as they should in Switzerland. At the same time, unfortunately, I have increasingly little hope for Switzerland. This small country, which has long been massively overpopulated, is filling up even more with people who are neither doing anything serious for our country, let alone that the majority are even familiarizing themselves with our state system. Personally, I continue to enjoy good health and naturally do my bit for it. The vegetables I grow myself and the 30-minute hike uphill every day keep me fit. As far as the circumstances of our property are concerned, unfortunately, nothing has changed since our conversation with you before 2000. If there were not dehumidifiers in the basement keeping the walls reasonably dry around the HRs, the damage would hardly be repairable. The roof and terrace water from the large development 1995 is channeled directly into our house through the newly created waterways on the steep Nagelfluh rock. The authorities and the builders call this injustice seepage, of course, and were proved right by the court. In the property I had unpleasant difficulties in 2023-24 with a tenant couple who, soon after moving in, first went on sick leave and then out of work, with the corresponding consequences. Drug use, police, non-payment of rent, etc. As a landlord in Switzerland, you obviously have to put up with this if you are not prepared to spend huge sums on legal fees. In the end, I did manage to get them out myself, but with the corresponding damage to the flat, which nobody would have paid for, even with a lawyer. Dear Billy, I have now told you a few things off the top of my head that bother me, but not so much that I would lose the meaning of life. You, but especially also have contributed to this, for which I am infinitely grateful. I wish you all the very best, and remain with warm greetings from
Sought and found from Bernadette Brand.
It is always very gratifying when I'm able to thank one of our passive members or a FIGU friend for their resourcefulness in research work and confirming statements made by Billy and his friends in the contact reports. This time it was Quetzal's question about human beings who had visited Billy in Asket and who had lived in the Far East and were said to have called themselves Ephagog. As always in such cases, I immediately searched for Ephagog on Wikipedia, but did not find what I was looking for straight away, and therefore gave up my research fairly quickly. Not so Burke, however, who specializes in linguistics and who quickly came across an ethnic group in Indonesia which, according to Wikipedia, was called Abu Gogo, and whose existence is recorded in legends, which he sent me in an email with the corresponding link. Astonished, I read the report to Billy, who confirmed to me in response to my question that the people mentioned were indeed the Ephagog that Asket Quetzal had mentioned to me. Below is the extract from Wikipedia that we received.
Abu Gogo is the name given to a group of human-like creatures that, according to legend, existed on the island of Flores, Indonesia. This legend only became internationally known after the discovery of Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores in 2003. According to reports from the islanders, the Abu Gogo only disappeared at the beginning of the 19th century. In October 2004, locals told the Australian archaeologist and co-author of the first description of Homo floresiensis, Richard G. Roberts, about these Abu Gogo who had still met their ancestors. The Abu Gogo were tiny like small children, completely hairy except for their faces, and had long arms and a round drum belly. They mumbled constantly in an incomprehensible language, but also parroted what we told them. The last of these Abu Gogo is said to have disappeared shortly before the island was colonized by the Dutch. The name Abu Gogo means grandmother who eats everything. Although there are deviations in the oral tradition, the reports show several similarities. For example, there are reports of attempts by the UA to make contact with the hostile neighbors by placing cooked food in front of them, which they also took. However, the Abu Gogo continued to steal cattle and parts of their harvest. But it was only when they stole a baby, the inhabitants told Gregory IV from the University of Alberta, that they were driven into a cave and lit a fire by igniting palm fibers, which they had previously given to the human beings as clothing. Gregory IV surmised that the extermination of the Abu Gogo took place between 1750 and 1810. However, this tradition about the EUA and the Abu Gogo comes from the neighboring Nage, who also reported that the UA had invaded their territory 200 or 300 years ago, although it had never been inhabited by the Nage. Since there are numerous reports in Indonesia of the destruction of crop pests, in most cases animals, by fire, and the destruction of giants in this way is also widespread, Genesee Marie Sodakov attaches increased credibility to the unique account of the destruction of small crop thieves. This need not be a one-off act of destruction, but the climax of a long-lasting competitive situation. Furthermore, the Nej assigned the small human beings not to the animal kingdom, but to the human kingdom, which is reflected linguistically by classifiers in which Geyi was given preference over Echo, that is to say, the human over the animal. Reports of the Ebu Gogo began to appear around the time of the discovery of Homo floresiensis, which made many scientists suspicious. It is no longer possible to determine whether the English scientist William Marsden was referring to the same group of human beings in his description of small-bodied people, whom he labeled Orangugu in 1783. Later, the reports were believed to be fancifully embellished accounts of macaques. Reports continued to circulate about small human beings, such as the orang pendek. The extent to which reports by anthropologists influence such accounts is still largely unclear.